In our conversation that we're having at the moment, or we will be having, obviously, on what is the alternative to the economic and fiscal policy of this government, is there one? And do we just have to accept that pain is a part of that? There is a sort of another course running. It's just underneath. And our next guest is going to talk about that as well. I've got a lot of time for Peter Scott. He is the chairperson of ECAN, and he is a no-nonsense, straight-up dude who chairs a regional council that I think is the largest regionally in New Zealand. Actually, I'll bring him into the conversation now, and then I'll introduce the topic. Peter, is that right? Welcome to the show. You're the largest regional council in New Zealand?
Yes, we are, Michael. That's right. That's correct. Outside of Auckland, in terms of numbers, also population. Right,
but in terms of geography, where does it go from? So you've got all the way from sort of Blenheim, down to
the Clarence. The Clarence is our top boundary above Kaikoura, and then we run to the top of Lindis, which is a bit. It's into Otago country, but regional council, your area, Michael, but. Because it's the watershed for the Waitaki River, that's the catchment-based approach.
Right, so you're based upon the rivers are your boundaries then. All right, Peter, the reason I've asked you on the show is because you're sort of the contradiction of what the economists are saying at the moment. The economists are saying, as a result of Adrian Orr yesterday, and it's certainly a big criticism that's coming from the opposition parties, that the government's spending too much money, and that is driving, according to the Treasury, inflationary problems and pressures in the economy, which we're now having to contend with high interest rates and a high OCR to try and get under control. But on the other hand, you and two other of your regional council chairs have written in the last 48 hours to various ministers of the Crown saying, listen, you've just turned the tap of funding off for us on a particular issue. And that is going to place at risk the entire South Island from the threat of a particular biological pest. Can you take us through that?
Well, Michael, so in 2020 there was funding announced in terms of getting on top of moulding pines, and the issue really was that we needed to do a massive knockdown of the feedstock and do the moulding pine issue, and then. Once we've done that knockdown, we'd transition back to farmer responsibility or landowner responsibility in terms of controlling the problem. We've got about halfway through that in terms of where we need to be, and funding has been pulled from us. Like, I'll talk from a Canterbury example, 3.58 million this year and 1.5 from our ratepayers, 1.5 million from our ratepayers. But it means that $9 million worth of that work is being deferred. In the 2023-24 season, our first of our maintenance cycle was due. So it was about chasing around where you've been and then starting to tidy up. By 26, $26 million of work will be required in 24-25. And so we're getting behind really, really quickly. When the program was announced, it created 200 jobs across the South Island, shovel-ready jobs. And we made it clear to the ministers at that time that we wanted to ensure that workforce, which is a brilliant workforce, be maintained, because those people are doing vital work. And there's not a lot of money here, Michael. We're talking nationally, that's not a lot of money to put into a program where we're going to get on top of that. The outcomes of not doing that work, and it had been identified by the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, is that we're threatening Indigenous biodiversity. We're changing large landscape, scale of landscape. We're getting pines when we've got that big, wide open country that you have in central Otago and we have in Canterbury. Our water quantity, due to a reduction in retention, will be affected. And a long bow, but availability of water for hydro generation could be impeded. And there's a big increase and risk of wildfires and those other things. So we are concerned about that.
Okay, and understandably so. For most people, though, that are listening to the show, in fact, I suspect most of New Zealand, wilding pines is sort of, they sort of hear it, it sort of conjures up some sort of, image, and then they move on. they don't perceive it to be as great a threat as a lot of other biological threats or pests in this country. Can you? You've just explained, I think, what the impact, if you like, of wilding pines are. But just to get some sort of level or scale of it, how long, if you just let it go, if you just let wilding pines go without attacking them, without taking them out, without rooting them out systematically, poison them, you don't burn them, I don't think. What would that mean for New Zealand?
Well, if people have driven through, the Maniopoto area and the Mackenzie area and seen those landscapes, well, those landscapes will start looking like Canada. They'll be green. It'll change forever the way you can do that, because it's exponential, this growth of these pines. So after about 3 or 4 years, when they've taken hold, they will just flourish, and it'll be twice the problem. We've talked in other areas where we're talking about resilience funding, and I talked to you about that too, Michael, and maybe another chance to do that. But every dollar we spend now, so every dollar we spend on wildings, we're probably saving 50 in the future. So it seems to me to be judicious that we do this. And it's not viewed by central government that it's a big issue. I guess it's because New Zealand isn't in the South Island where the issue is. I'm not sure of any other reason.
Is this only a South Island issue?
It is only a South Island issue in terms of the intensity of the problem at this point in time. But my other colleagues from around the country are saying that this type of issue, these biosecurity issues that we're having, and biodiversity issues that we're having, are starting to emerge across the rest of the country, and indeed places in the North Island.
It was really interesting. When I moved to Otago, I was actually approached by a former All Black, a relatively well-known one who has retired down here. And he said, what's the problem with having pine trees all over, as does happen, as you've given indications of that in Scandinavia and in Canada? And your answer to that, I guess, would be because we've got unique landscapes that attract national and international visitors here. They could go and see that in Canada.
Absolutely. The Graham Sydney stuff that's been so well known about, that big sky area that we have in those regions is really, really important. The aesthetics of that are really, really important to everybody. And what we're doing is trying to maintain the fact that they are there, that they are appreciated. And you're dead right, that they are there for other people to enjoy. Once we lose that, we're living in the middle of forest. We could be living anywhere.
And I guess the other thing too, it's not just landscape and aesthetic values, but you just mentioned about water. Pine trees, or the wilding pines, scoop up a lot of water as well. So they are quite an invasive species, but they also crowd out native bush, native trees, anything, in actual fact at all, because they tend to poison the ground under them. Is that right?
That's right. Look, I think there's all those things, and there's also then you create a habitat for predators. We start losing indigenous species in terms of wildlife, and those are the things that we're working really hard on the other hand to try and protect. And this is just a part of that big picture, Michael. We need to speak up now about this, because it may seem a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money to put into an effort over a massive area of ground between, as I said to you before, let's even just consider the South Island that we're trying to spend this money on, protect what we have.
Now, the great irony, of course, is that at the same time that the Parliamentary Environment Commissioner is saying this is a good thing to do, what you're suggesting, you've got others like the Climate Change Commissioner who are saying grow more trees and grow them really quickly. And obviously the tree that they choose is Pinus radiata and many of the pine varieties. Does this, and so that's created a carbon forestry interest and industry in this country. Does that increase the risk of wilding pines or decrease it, or isn't it relevant?
Look, my understanding of of pines isn't all that great, but I understand the two hybrid varieties of pines that they're putting into carbon farming do not produce the seedlings that will produce wildings. So I think they're reasonable, but that's a whole other debate in terms of productive agriculture, isn't it? I don't want to get into that debate, but there's certainly people down your way who are really concerned about that.
All right. So, and as you say, what you're trying to do is this. In actual fact, COVID worked quite nicely for you. At least the government's largesse or funding, because it allowed you to attack the wilding prime problem. But now that the brakes have gone on, or at least they've been applied some of that funding elsewhere, how long before you go back? And this is the irony of it. How many years do you suggest you would before you get back to the position you were before you got that COVID funding and Jobs for Nature funding?
Well, I think the issue that we have here, as I tried to point out earlier on, was the people that are working in this area. The people that have been recruited into this area out of tourism and other areas around COVID time, we had that work available. That work is still there. If we take the funding out of that, we lose those people. And, where will they end up? They'll probably end up in Western Australia and mines and all those sorts of areas, because they are those people that love that outdoor work, and they're very, very good at it. And we should be really proud of that workforce we've created, and we should try and retain them as much as possible.
All right. You've written to the ministers, Damien O'Connor, Willow Jean Prime, who's the Minister of Conservation. Now, that's an irony. David Parker, the Minister for the Environment, Joe Luxton, the Associate Minister for Agriculture. I look at that list, I've got to be honest with you, and I don't see somebody who has the ear of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance, or do you?
Well, I'm not sure on that, Michael. I think in the first instance we need, if we can have that conversation with those ministers, we will, because we want really, if we can't get anything else out of this, a holding pattern for those people that I've already pointed to. As I said earlier, this is a knockdown and then a transition back to those people who are the landholders to take care of the problem. And the initial knockdown is a massive issue. And we would just like to think that, we can have some sort of maintenance of capacity to do that work. If it's not in this year, then certainly next year.
Well, the irony of all this would seem to be, though, that the government's junior coalition partner, the Greens, you would expect to be knocking on the door on this one as well, because it's so critical in terms of preserving New Zealand's natural landscapes and environment. Where are they on this issue?
Look, I'm not 100% on that. We do intend to have a pretty in-depth conversation in Canterbury with Minister James Shaw.
Yeah, co-leader of the party. Yeah.
Yeah, and because the work that he's doing, it does lead to some of this. I think that there needs to be, a more comprehensive look at this for the South Island. I think we miss out in a lot of areas in the South Island in terms of funding, Michael. I think this is just another one of them, really. And
that's just, Peter, if I was to, take your hat off of the regional council and you were to make a dispassionate political observation, not enough voters down here?
Yeah, you did right. You did right. We see that. I'm just at local government actually in Wellington at the moment, and I mean, if there was a vote here, the North Island swings that vote pretty heavily in terms of, how many hands they could put up.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
Peter, best of luck to you. Thank you very much for spending the time with us this morning, and we'll keep in contact, see how you go. Okay, mate?
Good on you, Michael. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That is Peter Scott. He is the chair of the Canterbury Regional Council, ECAN, I think it's called. They've gone through a lot of trouble, ECAN, in the last 20 years. They had all their commissioners sacked. Do you remember that? And that was by a national government. Was that by a national government? Yeah, I think it was, wasn't it? Yes. All sorts of internecine strife and stuff like that. Anyhow, cut a long story short, that's where we are. Now, you see, the reason I interviewed him apropos the conversation is because the government's cutting funding there, but it's still got, tens of thousands of bureaucrats that it's employed, or consultants, in the government sector, the public government sector over the last 5 years. Now, they're not losing their job, but I guess they live in Wellington, don't they? What do you think?